January 1941. 10,000 feet. The skies above the English Channel. The night was not silent. It was a dense, suffocating canvas of cold and perpetual distant thunder, the sound of the war machine grinding on. Below, the coastal lights of Britain were a blacked-out rumour, protected by the thick fear of the unknown. Yet up here in the cold, clear void, a different terror was taking shape. It was not the roar of a bomber formation. It was a single, insistent whisper. The thin, high drone of a reconnaissance plane, fast and untouchable, slicing through the midnight air. This was the Luftwaffe's intelligence machine at work, a ghost that saw everything and left no trace. The aircraft, a modified Junkers Ju-88, rode the edge of the stratosphere, its cameras tirelessly mapping the invasion defenses, the supply lines, and the industrial heartland of a nation fighting for its life. For the young men of RAF Fighter Command, this ghost was an insult, a perpetual invisible wound. Their pride, the Spitfire and the Hurricane, were legends of the daylight, lords of the scramble, but in the darkness they were blind falcons, useless. They could chase, they could strain their eyes against the empty moon, but the German scouts always vanished into the Atlantic vastness, their intel safely tucked away in Frankfurt or Berlin. The reconnaissance pilot was the most dangerous man in the air, because he didn't drop bombs, he dropped certainty. This nightly humiliation was the crucible of desperation. The British knew they were losing the technological edge. German aircraft were faster, flew higher, and their pilots were masters of radio navigation. The Allied leadership, faced with this crippling blindness, turned to a last-ditch, deeply unglamorous solution. They called it, officially, Airborne Interception Radar. But to the test pilots and the ground crews, the clunky, unreliable, valve-ridden monstrosity was quickly dubbed the Old Hunting Dog. It was not a term of endearment. The radar equipment was a technological Frankenstein, born in makeshift labs. A heavy, heat-generating tangle of wires and brittle glass valves, it looked less like the future of air power and more like a poorly maintained television set bolted into the nose of an aircraft never designed to carry it. The first attempts to fly it were disastrous. The apparatus generated so much heat it baked the radar operator, and so much electrical noise it deafened the radio. The antennas, resembling an absurd array of coat hangers bolted to the wings, ruined the aerodynamics. The aircraft that carried it, often the rugged but unsophisticated Bristol Beaufighter, became sluggish, heavy, and a joke among the faster fighter units. The very idea that this cumbersome, temperamental box of tricks, which often failed just as the target came into range, displaying nothing but a meaningless, swirling green chaos, could save the British war effort was met with an almost universal, bitter laughter. "They brought this heap of junk in," recalled Flight Sergeant Jack Wilson, a veteran air gunner forced to cross-train as a radar operator, his voice tight with the memory of frustration. The engineer, sweating and apologetic, called it the eye of the night. "I called it a damn oven. You sat in the back, staring at a screen the size of a dinner plate, waiting for a blip that never came. The pilot, bless his heart, he couldn't see anything either. We were flying blind, strapped to a scientific nightmare. It was laughable. And the Germans did laugh." Intelligence reports reaching the Luftwaffe dismissed the early British attempts at night fighting as negligible. They understood the sheer physics of the problem. To intercept a high-speed scout at night required not only detection but pinpoint accuracy. Human eyes were useless. The German war machine trusted speed, altitude, and superb engineering. They believed, with absolute certainty, that they held the keys to the night skies. Their reconnaissance crews flew with a swaggering confidence, secure in the knowledge that any British attempt to stop them was doomed to fail. The irony was a cruel joke, playing out at 10,000 feet. While the British relied on a system that was technologically despised and practically broken, the German reliance on their own perceived invulnerability was about to become their greatest strategic weakness. The Old Hunting Dog, for all its flaws and the mocking laughter it provoked, carried within its tangled wires a seed of revolutionary change, a potential that, if fully realized, would not only track a single scout, but would utterly blind and terrorize the night-flying Luftwaffe, proving that the future of air combat was not about the sleekness of the wing, but the ghost-catching power of the screen. The question was not if the radar could work, But when would the pilots and engineers manage to harness its terrifying potential, transforming it from a punchline into a predator? The answer would decide the fate of the bombing war and the intelligence battle over Europe. If the darkness and drama of this untold story has caught your attention, consider subscribing to the channel. We have 6 more chapters of technical detail, human experience, and high-stakes history coming up that you won't want to miss. The birth of the hunting dog was a testament to desperation. In the labyrinthine halls of the Telecommunications Research Establishment, far from the polished drawing rooms of aircraft designers, a brilliant, frantic team of scientists worked around the clock. Their brief was impossible: invent eyes for the blind and do it yesterday. The result was the Air Interception Mark IV radar set. To the modern mind, accustomed to solid-state digital precision, the MKT-SE was a relic of a forgotten age. It weighed over 300 pounds. Its power source was a staggering array of vacuum tubes, glass bulbs that glowed with intense visible heat, consuming electrical current at an alarming rate. It was a microwave oven, a telephone exchange, and a furnace, all crammed into the already cramped fuselage of a 2-seater fighter. The principle, however, was revolutionary. It involved transmitting a focused short pulse of radio energy from the nose antenna and listening, with an almost agonizing sensitivity, for the minuscule echo reflected by a nearby enemy aircraft. That echo would then appear as a glowing, moving signal, a blip, on the cathode ray tube display. This small circular screen was the Holy Grail, a visual representation of an invisible enemy. The logistical nightmares were endless. The massive power demands forced the installation of extra generators. The heat was so intense, it caused components to fail mid-flight, and in the tight rear cockpit of the Beaufighter, the radar operator often flew in a state of semi-delirium, sweat plastering his uniform to the seat. Worse, the very act of generating a powerful radio signal created immense interference. When the set was switched on, it was nearly impossible to use the standard radio to talk to the ground. The crew was either blind or deaf, rarely both. Engineers working with the unforgiving realities of wartime materials and pressure fought a losing battle against fragility. The vibrations of the twin Bristol Hercules engines rattled the delicate valves to pieces, forcing crews to replace them almost every flight. Squadron leader Peter Thorne, one of the first test pilots to take the MiG-04 into the dark, recorded his initial impressions with a mixture of awe and scathing cynicism. The thing is a marvel of theoretical physics, granted, but in practice it's a joke. I remember one sortie where the damn thing just went blank, completely blank. We flew for 2 hours, freezing, knowing a German was out there somewhere, and my operator, poor chap, was just staring at a dead green circle. When we landed, we found a mouse had chewed through a primary power cable. A mouse? That's our defense against the might of the Luftwaffe. This skepticism permeated the Air Force. Veteran pilots, the men who lived and died by their keen eyesight and instincts, viewed the radar operators, known colloquially as boffins or scope dopes, with a deeply ingrained suspicion. To them, air combat was a ballet of skill and guts, not a sedentary exercise in interpreting glowing dots. They argued the weight cost too much speed, the system was too complex to be reliable, and the sheer intellectual effort of interpreting the screen distracted from the essential job of flying and fighting. The German side, meanwhile, continued to refine their visual and radio-based reconnaissance. The Ju-88 scouts, in particular, were marvels of engineering. Stripped of armament and armor, their engines were tuned to push them to altitudes approaching 30,000 feet, where the air was too thin for most Allied fighters to operate effectively. Their pilots, specially selected for their navigational prowess and unflappability, relied on the Wavefaren radio navigation beam, a system of frightening accuracy that guided them to targets deep within the British Isles and back to Germany with minimal risk. German aerial reconnaissance reports from 1941 spoke of minimal interruption, of clear, unmolested runs over Liverpool, Birmingham, and the naval bases at Scapa Flow. Their summary: the British night defences were fragmented, disorganised, and technologically backward. The confidence of the Axis command was built on this consistent, hard-won intelligence. The strategic contradiction was hardening. On one side, a sleek, proven high-altitude weapon of intelligence gathering, supported by sophisticated radio technology. On the other, a lumbering, temperamental night fighter, saddled with a delicate, half-baked invention that broke at the slightest tremor, dismissed by its own crews as an old hunting dog. The stage was set for a narrative of improbable reversal. The raw, fragile technology was the key. It needed only the right human hands to transform it from a scientific curiosity into a devastating weapon, a process that would require not just engineering genius, but a profound, almost mystical synchronization between the pilot and the man staring into the void of the green screen. The technology was only half the battle. The other half was the man staring into the green glow. The air interception system didn't just require a crew. It demanded a new kind of human being, a partnership based on utter, almost telepathic trust. This was the era of the radar observer, a role that was lonely, terrifying, and completely divorced from the traditional heroism of the pilot. We follow the arc of one such pairing: Flight Officer Arthur Cale, the pilot, and Sergeant David Smudge Smith, the observer. Cale was a Spitfire veteran, a man of aggressive instinct and superb eyesight, forced to transition to the heavy, sluggish bowfighter. He was initially one of the chief skeptics, mourning the loss of his speed and maneuverability. Smith, on the other hand, was a quiet, almost academic young man who had never flown a plane before his assignment. His expertise was in applied physics, his world the mathematics of radio waves, not the physics of lift and drag. The observer's cockpit was a claustrophobic hell. Crammed behind the pilot, surrounded by the humming, glowing mass of the Menkopaiv, Smith's only window to the world was the 4-inch diameter scope. The isolation was intense. While Cale wrestled with the heavy controls, the vibrations and the constant threat of a stall, Smith sat backward to the direction of flight, encased in heat and the electrical whine of the set, trying to interpret the language of light. His task was a brutal exercise in geometry under pressure. The radar provided distance, the range circle, and direction, the angle of the blip. It was Smith's job to constantly interpret these two variables and translate them into simple, precise vector instructions for Cale. Turn 5 degrees port, dive slightly, hold speed 240. Every second mattered. The faster the target, the more quickly the geometry changed. A single error in calculation, a moment of hesitation, meant the German scout would break the narrow radar cone, vanish, and the mission would fail. Training was a punishing cycle of failure. The early attempts were conducted against friendly bombers, nicknamed Stooges. The results were abysmal. Cale would fly the instructions Smith shouted, but the aircraft, heavy and lumbering, would inevitably overshoot or undershoot the target. The mental strain was immense. Cale was constantly fighting the urge to tear off his oxygen mask and just look into the darkness, to trust his instincts. Smith was fighting the electrical failures, the blinding glare of the scope, and the crushing knowledge that the lives of his crew depended on his ability to read a faint, flickering dot. It was like trying to catch a fly in a sealed box while blindfolded, Cale recounted years later, the stress still palpable in his voice. I couldn't feel the enemy. I couldn't see the enemy. I just had this voice, a Smudge's voice, calm and detached, telling me what to do. Every instinct I had as a fighter pilot screamed, "Don't trust it." I was turning into a robot, guided by a man I barely knew, who was guided by a faulty machine. But necessity breeds connection. Smith and Cale developed their own lexicon, a shorthand that transcended standard flight protocol. The instructions became less formal, more visceral. "Too hot, Arthur, back the stick, or he's running right, get on his tail, you dog." The psychological pressure on Smith, the radar observer, was arguably greater than that on the pilot. The pilot had the action, the controls, the chance to fire. The observer had only anticipation. He was the hunter, but he had no gun. He had to guide his pilot, his gunner, into the narrow, critical firing zone of 200 to 400 yards, all while holding his composure against the background noise of static and the throbbing heat of the radar set. This human arc of transformation, from a skeptical pilot and a nervous scientist to a unified, deadly weapon, was the true breakthrough. The old hunting dog was nothing without the synchronicity of the two men in the cockpit. They had to learn to interpret the machine's flaws as quickly as its strengths. A brief surge of static might indicate a temporary power fluctuation, or it might be the reflection of rain squalls, or it might be the enemy performing an evasive maneuver. The interpretation was not scientific, it was art, born of hundreds of hours of cold, frustrating failure. The German scouts, meanwhile, continued their nightly runs, unaware that their enemy had begun to breed a new type of predator. These pilot who flew not by the stars or the horizon, but by the relentless cold logic of a green blip. The technology was finally stable. Now the men were becoming ready. And when the two aligned, the German complacency would be shattered by a new and terrifying reality. They were no longer alone in the dark. To understand the arrogance that had settled over the Luftwaffe reconnaissance arm, one must appreciate the sheer quality of their equipment and training. These were not the hurried, mass-produced machines of the later war. These were precision instruments of intelligence. The Junkers Ju-88, in its reconnaissance variants like the D-1, was a masterpiece of speed and range. Luftwaffe pilots considered their missions to be less of a combat sortie and more of a private, high-speed cruise over enemy territory. Their motto could have been, "Speed and silence." They flew so high, their contrails were often mistaken for cirrus clouds, disappearing before any British fighter could gain the necessary altitude, and they flew so fast they were rarely on the radar screen of the primitive ground-based British systems for long enough to trigger an effective response. The German advantage was multifaceted, extending beyond the airframe. Their navigation was peerless. Using the aforementioned Widerfahren and its later iterations, they were guided by ground-based radio beams broadcast from occupied Europe. The intersection of two beams defined the target, allowing the pilot to fly through fog, cloud, and the darkest night with astonishing positional accuracy. This system of guided navigation was the eyes of the German night operation, a complex, elegant solution that gave their crews a profound sense of security. For the German crews, flying over Britain was often a spectacle, not a trial. Flight Lieutenant Hans Kessel, a Ju-88 reconnaissance pilot, noted in his diary from 1941, "Tonight we saw London. It was a black velvet carpet, sprinkled with diamonds where the flares fell. No pursuit. The searchlights were like slow, blind fingers, harmlessly sweeping the abyss below us. We are ghosts up here. They cannot touch us. They fly blind down there. Their technology is primitive. They rely on their eyes, which are useless at 25,000 feet. The psychological impact of this invulnerability was profound. It bred confidence, professionalism, and a degree of operational risk-taking that would ultimately prove fatal. Because they were so rarely challenged, German crews became predictable. They followed established flight paths, known corridors that maximized camera coverage and minimized fuel consumption. Why vary the route when the enemy was incapable of intercepting you? This German complacency was the great strategic gift to the British. It meant that if the old hunting dog could manage to find one German scout on its established route, it could find them all. The problem was breaking the pattern, proving that the night was no longer safe. The initial British attempts to use the Mk-I-4 radar were so inconsistent that they only served to reinforce the German belief in their technological superiority. German radio intelligence, which was highly effective at monitoring British airwaves, intercepted the frustrated chatter between the ground controllers and the night fighters. They heard the desperate calls of pilots who had lost contact, the confused reports of radar operators whose screens were filled with nothing but static, and the final defeated acknowledgements of failed interceptions. These intercepts became part of the official Luftwaffe briefing, confirming the British failure. What was ridicule on the Allied side, the name Old Hunting Dog, was genuine strategic certainty on the Axis side. This technology posed no credible threat. The German night fighter units, established to protect the homeland against the slow, infrequent incursions of British bombers, were also becoming adept at scouting the scouts. They began to fly forward patrols into the zone over the Channel, a proactive strategy based on the conviction that no serious threat to their reconnaissance arm could emerge from the dark. This was an example of overconfidence in action. The enemy was not just the Ju-88, it was the entire interlocking system of German night operations, all predicated on the failure of British technology. The stage was set for the reversal. The invisible hunter was about to be hunted by an equally invisible and far more lethal predator. The psychological terror was about to shift entirely. The laughter of the high-flying, untouchable German pilots would soon freeze in their throats, replaced by a deep existential dread. The realization that the blackness of the night, once their sanctuary, had suddenly been weaponized against them. The transition from being the unseen hunter to the terrified prey would be the most abrupt and shocking plot twist of the air war. The transformation from scientific curiosity to lethal weapon began on a specific night in June 1941. The weather was atrocious, thick, low cloud cover with intermittent rain squalls, the kind of night the German scouts loved. The conditions negated visual search entirely, forcing the British to rely entirely on the much-maligned old hunting dog. On this night, Flight Officer Cale and Sergeant Smith, the crew introduced in Actor Thread, were flying a routine, desperate patrol over the North Sea. Their Beaufighter felt like a boat churning through heavy seas, buffeted by the turbulence. The electrical humming of the Mach-4 filled the cabin, interspersed with the crackle of static. Smith was staring at the scope, willing a blip to appear, when the impossible happened. At 01:17 hours, a distinct firm signal appeared on the extreme edge of the radar screen's range circle, a faint but steady luminescence. Smith, fighting the temptation to dismiss it as a momentary glitch, immediately began his calculations. "Contact, bearing 065, range 10 miles, moving fast, Arthur." Cale's initial reaction was skepticism, a conditioned response to months of false alarms. "Smudge, check your set. It's probably a trawler or one of our own returning." "Negative, Arthur. The signature is clean, it's high and it's fast. I have a lock." This was the first true test of the human equation. Cale had to suppress every ingrained flying instinct and submit entirely to the voice from the back cockpit. He adjusted the throttles, wrestled the heavy controls, and began the intricate geometric pursuit, guided solely by Smith's calm, relentless instructions. The chase was excruciating. At 10 miles, the target was a blip. At 5 miles, Smith entered the critical zone, the inner circles of the screen. This was where the Mimkiri-4 was at its most sensitive and most temperamental. The target, a high-flying Dornier Du-17 reconnaissance scout, was directly ahead. The geometry demanded a precise approach. Cale had to position his aircraft below and slightly behind the Dornier, using the cover of its exhaust. 3 miles. 2 miles. Steady. Steady. He's closing in, Arthur. 1 mile. You must see him now. Smith's voice was strained, a tight, high wire of concentration. Cale was peering desperately through the windscreen, his eyes straining for any flicker of light or shadow. Nothing. The tension was immense. They were at point-blank range, yet completely blind. This was the moment that usually ended in a frustrated break-off. "I can't see a damn thing, Smudge. If he turns, we overshoot," Cale yelled over the radio. "Trust the blip, Arthur. He is 400 yards dead ahead, slightly high. Now!" "Break cloud." Cale, with a gut-wrenching leap of faith, pulled the nose up sharply, trusting a 4-inch screen more than his 5 years of flying experience. As the Beaufighter climbed violently, they burst out of the cloud cover, and there it was. 400 yards ahead, framed against the faint shimmering light of the moon behind the clouds, was the unmistakable twin-engine silhouette of the Dornier Du-17. The sight of the enemy, appearing out of absolute darkness with the precision of a jeweler's finding, was a shock that Cale would never forget. The German pilot had no warning. His confidence in the darkness was his undoing. Cale didn't hesitate. He hammered the firing button. The 4 20mm Hispano cannons and 6 303 machine guns roared to life, spewing a terrifying torrent of explosive and tracer rounds. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Dornier dissolved into fire, spiraling down into the churning black water below. The air in the Beaufighter's cockpit was thick with the smell of cordite and ozone. The silence after the guns stopped was deafening. Smith, slumped in his seat, could only whisper, "Got him, Arthur. We actually got him." This single interception was more than a kill. It was the proof of concept. It proved the geometry was sound, the mathematics of the radar were correct, and the human equation, the trust between Cale and Smith, was the final, crucial component. The message that went back to Fighter Command was simple: the old hunting dog hunts. The laughter was finally gone. It was replaced by a grim professional determination on the Allied side, and a chill of genuine unease beginning to settle over the high-flying corridors of the Luftwaffe. The night was no longer empty. A new invisible predator had taken wing. The success of Kale and Smith's initial kill was quickly duplicated by others. The data, the new tactics, and the refined instructions were rapidly disseminated throughout the burgeoning night fighter squadrons. Engineers worked with renewed purpose, tweaking the Mech-Y-4 into the more stable Mech-V and F-8 models, reducing the electrical interference and the internal heat. The old hunting dog was shedding its puppy fat and growing its teeth. The true moment of strategic reversal, the night that justified the document title, came in the early autumn of 1941, a pivotal evening that Fighter Command referred to simply as the clearing. The conditions were perfect for German intelligence gathering, clear skies stretching from the Channel to the Midlands. 6 dedicated German reconnaissance scouts were dispatched, 2 high-altitude Ju-88s and 4 medium-altitude Dornier, all flying their predictable pre-planned routes. This was a maximum-effort intelligence sweep, an assumption of total impunity. The British response was a coordinated, radio-silent operation. Instead of waiting for the ground radar to detect the inbound enemy, 7 specially equipped Beaufighters were vectored to patrol the known corridors of German entry. Kale and Smith were among them, flying a newly refitted aircraft with a far more stable version of the radar. The clock struck 23 gas hours. The first contact was immediate. An incoming Ju-88, flying at a comfortable 28,000 feet. The German pilot, confident in his altitude, made no evasive maneuvers. Kale and Smith, guided by the perfected blip-chasing technique, climbed relentlessly, the radar providing a constant, cold, mathematical lock. The interception was swift and brutally efficient. The Ju-88, caught in the beam of the guns, plummeted into the dark. Barely had Kale completed his combat report when Smith's voice, now a model of professional detachment, announced, "Second contact. Low, Arthur. Heading west. Must be a Dornier on a coastal run." The rhythm of the hunt was established. The old hunting dog was no longer an experimental toy. It was a deadly integrated system. The radar provided the initial detection, the calculations provided the trajectory, and the twin-engined Beaufighter provided the platform for the 4 20mm cannons. The German crews, flying in isolation, began to report only silence. The first Dornier vanished without a trace. The second one, attempting to radio back an alert, was intercepted mid-transmission. The chilling silence that followed its cut-off signal was the first hint of panic on the German side. The invisible hunters were being silently devoured by an invisible force. In his memoirs, a German ground controller stationed in occupied France wrote of the terror of that night. The calls were regular, professional, then silence. No distress call, no cry of "Achtung," just a clean, sudden cut. One, then a half-hour later, another. We were watching our eyes disappear one by one into the black cloth. The laughter, the old arrogance about the British night capabilities, transformed into a cold, knotting terror. What was happening up there? We had no answers. By 04:30 in the morning, the tally was complete. 6 German reconnaissance aircraft were confirmed destroyed or missing. The statistical impact of that single night was immense. It represented a crippling blow to the Luftwaffe's intelligence-gathering efforts over Britain for a period of critical strategic planning. But the psychological effect was arguably greater. The German air crews realized, with dawning horror, that their night sanctuary had been breached. The darkness was no longer their ally. It was a camouflage for a lethal, unknown entity, a predator that flew without lights, without sound, and hunted by a science they had underestimated and dismissed. The legacy of the clearing was the end of unchallenged German reconnaissance. The Luftwaffe was forced to abandon predictable routes, fly higher, and sacrifice precious fuel for unpredictable evasion patterns, all of which degraded the quality and quantity of the intelligence they could gather. The technological underdog had roared. The old hunting dog was now recognized for what it was, the relentless, deadly future of night warfare. The night of the clearing marked the true inflection point in the secret war over the skies of Europe. The despised technology, the clumsy, valve-ridden old hunting dog, had finally proven its thesis, that the future belonged to the invisible. The immediate consequences were strategic. The British night-fighting squadrons, now fully operational and confident, began to exact a terrible toll. The success rate of interceptions skyrocketed. No longer was a German reconnaissance flight a near certainty. It became a high-risk gamble. The intelligence flow to the Axis High Command dried up, forcing them to rely on outdated or incomplete photographic evidence. This blind spot directly impacted strategic decisions, particularly concerning the deployment of defensive anti-aircraft batteries and the timing of planned counterattacks. But the legacy extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. The development of the air interception radar, born of desperation and skepticism, laid the absolute foundation for every subsequent air battle. The lessons learned from the crude Mockingbird 4 were immediately applied to the next generation of electronic warfare. 1. The shift to metric. The early successes proved the viability of airborne radar, spurring the rapid development of the crucial cavity magnetron, a British invention that allowed for the use of shorter, more precise wavelength radar, metric to centimetric. This led directly to the H-2S radar for bombers and the vastly superior AI Mach-8 8 for night fighters, which was so accurate it eliminated the need for searchlights entirely. 2. The rise of the observer. The role of the radar observer was cemented as critical. The partnership between pilot and navigator became the standard for all complex air operations, proving that the technical mind was just as essential to air combat as the aggressive instinct. 3. The electronics arms race. The German military, initially convinced of their own superiority, were shocked by the sudden, devastating efficiency of the British night defenses. Their response was frantic. The development of sophisticated radar detectors like the Naxos and Flensburg systems, and the implementation of electronic countermeasures. The air war devolved into a constant, escalating battle of detection versus deception, a complex electronic chess game that defined the remainder of the conflict. The story of the old hunting dog is ultimately a narrative about human courage overcoming technological limitations. It is the triumph of the determined scientist and the trusting pilot over the arrogance of proven design. The men like Sergeant Smith, the scope dopes, who sat in the heat and the dark, staring at a flickering screen, became the unsung heroes of the air. They flew a silent, lonely war guided only by geometry and faith. The aircraft that carried the radar, the sturdy, reliable Beaufighter and its more elegant successor, the de Havilland Mosquito, were phased out after the war, their exploits overshadowed by the jet age. The Mk 4 radar itself became a historical curiosity, destined for museum storage, its massive, glowing valves a testament to a bygone era of engineering. But the principle it pioneered, the ability to see in the dark, to track the invisible ghost, to weaponize the airwaves, is the true legacy. Every modern fighter jet, every guided missile, every sophisticated air defense system operating today owes its existence to the crude, cumbersome, laughed-at machine that flew in the cold January night of 1941. It proved that sometimes the most effective weapon in war is the one the enemy has underestimated the most. The laughter of the German scouts was silenced, not by superior speed, but by a superior, invisible eye. The old hunting dog never needed to be beautiful, it only needed to be relentless. And that, in the brutal calculus of total war, was everything. This story of technological desperation and human determination is only one chapter in the vast, untold history of the Second World War. If you found the tension, the technical details and the human drama compelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The electronic war is a deep well of secrets, and we have many more to uncover.